You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Something as serious as being involved with the Nazis, being involved with a Nazi killing unit, you'd think would warrant swift action from a government, but in Canada it has been anything but. The Canadian legal system has been working for about 25 years now to deport Helmut Oberlander, now 96, who in his younger years, in the time of the Holocaust and World War II, was a translator in a Nazi killing squad. He made a life for himself in Canada as a developer in the Waterloo area. He did not disclose his involvement with the Nazis when he came here, which is really the crux of the government's thrust to try to get him out of Canada. But this has become mired in multiple layers of bureaucracy, and as I said, 25 years after the process was initiated, he's still here. This week, yet another delay as the can was kicked a bit further down the road for a hearing that was supposed to happen. But really underscoring this, beyond all the legal arguments, is a fundamental question about whether there is a statute of limitations on the forms of crimes in which the Nazis were complicit and those involved with them. Joining me on the line is Shimon Koffler Fogel, who's the president and CEO of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Shimon, thank you so much for your time today.
Andrew, it's great to be with you again.
One of the biggest defenses we've seen of Helmut Oberlander from people is that, well, so much time has passed and he wasn't personally involved and he's made a life for himself. And as he gets older and older, he just starts to look like this frail man and people don't want to throw the book at him, so to speak. Why is it so important, in your view, to continue to prosecute and advocate for justice on these matters?
Well, Andrew, as you pointed out, this didn't begin in 2021. This began 26 years ago when he was less frail and less old. And I think the real core is based in your introduction about the question of statute of limitations. Is there a time after which accountability and responsibility for crimes of the proportion that the Nazis committed expire? And our view would be, for multiple reasons, no. Number one, there's a need for justice. There's a need for accountability. And Oberlander, however he might want to portray his involvement with the Nazis, was actively involved in units that actually went from location to location, rounding up Jews, Roma, and other undesirables, and brutally massacred all of them. So there has to be accountability for that. But it goes beyond that, because Oberlander also represents a challenge to our whole refugee and immigration policy. We have a set of criteria and laws that govern how people come into Canada, which after all is a refugee intake country. If those are going to be breached, it undermines the credibility of the whole system. And it's under enough strain that we should be able to say with some confidence that the laws are applied evenly, consistently, and across the board. But I would suggest, Andrew, that there's a more compelling reason than either of the ones that I've presented so far. We now live in a time when populism and nationalism has regained a certain entrenchment within society, well beyond Canada, but it certainly includes Canada. And we have a compelling responsibility to remind citizens, especially those who grew up and were born long after the Holocaust, of what potential there is for evil and for the kind of destruction that's associated with the Nazi regime. And if we give a pass to people like Oberlander, we're essentially diminishing and whitewashing the seriousness of what took place. And we can't then apply the lesson of never again. We are so desperate to build a better society, a more inclusive society. But if we allow in that inclusion those who really were the poster children for the exact opposite, then we're really undermining our own efforts.
When you say poster children, I feel there's an important dialogue here because, again, one of the defenses that I would appreciate your analysis of or your response to is when people use those terms, just a translator. Well, he wasn't personally the one killing. That distinction, in your view, is relatively irrelevant given the scope of evil the Nazis committed, correct?
Absolutely, Andrew. I think that everybody has the opportunity to do what's right or to acquiesce to what's wrong. A 17-year-old conscript is an adult, is somebody who's able to distinguish between what's morally acceptable and what is reprehensible. If we had people willing to stand up and push back against the dictate of the Nazis, then we would have had a very different outcome to World War II. So I think that you can't skirt accountability and responsibility for the personal decisions that you make. And it's not as if he was a translator for a weekend when they were in a particular venue. He was with the group. He was attached to it. He continued to operate with them and for them, and in essence was an enabler of the kind of murder and atrocity that those groups associated.
Yeah, and one of the things I should probably point out, I had the great privilege of accompanying a delegation from your organization, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, to Israel back in 2015 and visit Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum, and speak with a number of the people who have devoted their lives to studying and preserving this horrific chapter in history. And one of the things that came up, and I've seen it, especially in talking to younger Jewish people, is how the more time that passes between the Holocaust and now, the more abstract it becomes, and the fewer living survivors of it, people who have survived the Holocaust but have succumbed to old age, the harder it is to have that living memory. And in a lot of cases, Holocaust indifference is a big problem. And you raised an important point there when you said about never again. People need to remember that, yes, this is not something that just has fizzled out to history.
I think you're so right, Andrew. Look, when we try to undertake Holocaust education, for example, in the public school system here in Canada, we struggle to find ways to make it relatable to kids today who have no terms of reference, who don't really have any clue as to what the Holocaust was, how it came about, and how it could have been prevented. And as we struggle as a society, and we've had a pretty intense year, in addition to COVID, there was so much attention, and rightly so, to issues of racism and discrimination, some of it really built into the very fabric of our society. We have no possibility of addressing those in a constructive way if we don't have an appreciation for what things could have been and what things were. So when we look at the Uyghur in China, or we look at what's happening in Burma, or we look even to places like Eastern Europe and the Ukraine, we have to connect the dots between what was and what could be. And if we are dismissive of the past, if we simply whitewash people like Oberlander, then really we're condemning ourselves to repeating those terrible events and experiences of the past.
One thing that I would point out here, to go back to the Oberlander case, is that the government has tried, and I don't know if there are other tools that the government could have employed that would have expedited this. A lot of the issues have been in the courts and in some of the legal mechanisms there, and this has spanned liberal and conservative governments because of how long it's gone on. You know, if this country is not ultimately successful in deporting Helmut Oberlander, it really does show, I think, a profound lack of commitment in some way. I don't know the right word, but a lack of ability to see this through and understand the severity of it. I mean, if this had happened, for example, with someone whose role were less ambiguous or perceived as less ambiguous, I can't imagine that they would have allowed this to go on for 26 years. So it does strike me as very odd that this has not been successful. And this may well be, and in fact, it probably will be, the last such case ever in Canada and one of the last in the world. It's important to get it right.
So I think that's absolutely spot on, Andrew. I think one of the questions that has been triggered or prompted by this experience over 26 years. And you're quite right. Successive Canadian governments have endeavored. I think there were 4 definitive decisions taken to strip him of his Canadian citizenship and deport him to Germany, where he would stand trial. It prompts the question, how is our independent judiciary managing things in a way that simply makes sense? If the judiciary can be abused in the way that Oberlander's legal team has done it for 26 years, it begs the question, are we doing something wrong in terms of how we're organizing the legal process? Ensuring justice for the target of a particular prosecution has to be balanced by ensuring justice for the victims of the alleged crime. And I think that in this case, it is clear that the 15 or 20,000 survivors living here in Canada now, observing what's happening with Oberlander, are certainly bitterly asking themselves, where is the justice for me and the family that I lost?
Yeah, and one point I would raise here is that it seems like for the Oberlander legal team, the delay is the win. I mean, the guy's 96. Let's be real. The delay is the win. They don't need a court to declare them the victors. They just need to drag it out until such a point that he's reached his natural end.
I think that's exactly right. They're not looking for vindication. They're looking just to allow him to remain in place and be comfortable for the rest of his days, and thereby to dodge having to be accountable for what he's done. We have to remember the Canadian piece is only a portion of this process. It's not as if he would be deported simply because he misled immigration officials when he applied for Canadian citizenship. There's a court waiting to try him for war crimes. And for him not to be deported from Canada would mean that he never has to account for his decisions, for his actions, and his participation in the Nazi killing machine.
That's actually a tremendously valuable point. In a lot of cases, we view this as a deportation case, which is how it is legally, but it has a lot of the hallmarks of an extradition case as well, which I think that change in words has a very significant change in the perception of it. Shimon Koffler Fogel, President and CEO of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, thank you for your commitment to justice and accountability on this, Shimon.
Andrew, it's always great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.